Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 202, Why Did Shakespeare Write Troilus and Cressida? A conversation with Rachel Aanstad. For today's guest episode, it is a very warm welcome back to Racheal Aanstad. You will remember that Rachel and I have discussed Twelfth Night and A Midsummer Night's Dream on the podcast, and now she returns to discuss Troilus and Cressida. As you will hear, Rachel was able to bring thoughts about the history of the play and its sources, particularly Homer's Iliad, to the table, which, I think, really enhances our understanding of this challenging play. Racheal Aanstad is a writer, artist, historian and Shakespeare nerd with an MFA in theatre. She is the former artistic director of the Rose City Shakespeare Company and the author of A Bawdy Twelfth Night, or What You Will, an encyclopedia and dramaturgical handbook, and A Midsummer Night's Dream illustrated handbook and encyclopedia. She lives in the Pacific Northwest, from where I spoke to her over a Zoom call. So welcome, Rachel. This is your third time on the podcast, which I think makes you a friend of the podcast. And you have also been working recently with another friend of the podcast, Dr. Darren Feebry-Jones, on a new project for you both. So perhaps you want to tell us about that before we get stuck into Troilus and Cressida.
Yes, I'd love to. So Darren Feebry-Jones and I it's basically a YouTube channel that will evolve into a podcast. We've gotten started with a YouTube channel, and we talk about basically Shakespeare's world. And the title of the channel is Shakespeare and Friends. Our first episode was, did Shakespeare's audiences believe in ghosts? And basically we ask a question for each episode and then do our best to answer it by the end of the episode. And we have a little writer's corner where we talk about current projects, and then we have book recommendations too at the end. And so far we have 3 episodes up, and we've just been having a lot of fun. He's a wonderful person to talk to about Shakespeare, as you know well.
Indeed.
And we both look forward to recording the episode every month.
Excellent. So anyone who wants interested in finding out more about that can find it on YouTube very easily. Shakespeare and Friends. Shakespeare
and Friends, and it's an ampersand.
Okay.
And that will help you find it, because there's a lot of Shakespeare on YouTube, and that's a good thing. So it can be a little tricky to find us, but
there is, and I'm sure that yours and Darren's will be much more authoritative than much of the stuff that's out there on YouTube about Shakespeare.
Well, we have our own criteria, let's put it that way.
So I was very happy when you agreed to come and talk about Troilus and Cressida, because I have to confess it is probably the play of Shakespeare's that I found most difficult to get into so far. And I believe that I'm not alone in this.
You are definitely not alone in that. And I began really delving into it because I needed to write about it for my next book, Who's Who in Shakespeare's History Plays. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized that I didn't know anything about it at all, as often happens when you start to write about something you think you know about. And the first step was, of course, to read the Iliad, which Troilus and Cressida is a tiny sliver of.
Yeah.
So, as you address in your other episode that covers the history of the play, it went through several iterations, and, through Chaucer and people before him, finally ended up in Shakespeare's head somehow. He most likely read the Iliad, of course, and, Homer required reading at that point for young lads. And then Chaucer's treatment of it, what Shakespeare's motivations were for writing about, we can only guess, but certainly you are not the only one to find this difficult. The more I looked online for sources and the more I looked for books, the more dour and confused people became, and I became, about what is this play? Why did he write this? What is the point of it? And then I have to say that I watched an RSC production. It's available on Marquee Streaming of Troilus and Cressida that changed my view almost 180. Between that and reading the Iliad, really shifted my perspective on Troilus and Cressida. And now it's one of my very favorite plays. I really wish that I could produce it and direct it at this point. Unlikely, but it would be the first on my docket if I could.
Well, that certainly is a 180-degree turn then. I suppose what I found difficult about it, and I saw the production at Shakespeare's Globe in the summer, and I've watched a 1980 production that the BBC did as well. And it seems to me it lacks a sort of dramatic drive that virtually no other Shakespeare play lacks. You might put it in a category with Love's Labour's Lost in that sense, maybe, but even that has a beginning and an end and a middle to it. And I was left with Troilus and Cressida feeling, well, why did Shakespeare feel this was a good story to put his version out there? Because there had been other versions of it, and he does definitely put a different spin on it than other writers at the time did.
I think that's a really fair question. And I feel that Troilus and Cressida is Shakespeare's most modern play, almost postmodern in terms of its rejection, complete rejection of, an Aristotelian structure. Mm-hmm. Aristotle hadn't even been born yet. So I think it's fair to treat a story from before Aristotle as if he hadn't existed.
Yeah. There is a complete anachronism in there, isn't there? Because one character mentions Aristotle at one point, even though they were centuries before Aristotle was born.
Yeah. We'll allow for poetic license there. Yeah. But I think we really need to view Troilus and Cressida as a satire. And we're not used to Shakespeare writing satires. And, again, we can speculate. I think he was a very politically savvy individual. And satires were outright banned, at one point while he was writing. And they were in trouble when they wrote satires. But as we speculate, we think that he wrote this for the inns at court and for, a very specific set of people, an audience who would have read the Iliad, who would have been used to debating these different points in the Iliad. Was it right for Greece to win? What would have happened if Troy had won? Was Cressida right to, I hesitate to say betray, but to break her compact with Troilus and so on. And so these were regular topics of rhetorical exercises, which lawyers then and lawyers now practiced in order to get the skills for arguing at the bar. And so Troilus and Cressida feels just tailor-made for that particular audience. And so it's not surprising that modern audiences feel even less of a connection to it, have a hard time getting into it. But I truly believe that the fact that there is no tidy ending, that there isn't even really a main protagonist, really foreshadows a lot of the theater that came hundreds of years later. I think Shakespeare's really ahead of his time with this play.
So is there a particular type of theatre you would be comparing that to?
Well, like Pinter plays, there's no happy ending there.
That's true.
There's no heroes, there's no real protagonists. It's a description of, terrible circumstances and a terrible situation without any sugarcoating on it, without any pretending that, this is for the greater good, or, without any real morality preaching to the audience. Now, Shakespeare indulges in a little bit of that, I think, with Achilles. I think he holds Achilles up as an official bad example. But in general, we expect a lot less tidy endings from our modern playwrights than we do from Shakespeare or past playwrights.
Yes, and I have spoken several times about how Shakespeare could subvert expectations in his plays. I think we spoke about it ourselves when we spoke about Twelfth Night about a year ago. So maybe that's not so strange. But when I saw the production in London, I happened to be sitting next to a lady. We were chatting in the interval and afterwards, and she was a retired teacher, and it was her third viewing of Troilus and Cressida in an attempt to like it. I'm not sure she was convinced by the end, but she, like I, was really struggling with the why he wrote it question.
I do think that we don't have the context for the Iliad that Shakespeare did, and we don't have the context for Troilus and Cressida. When we watch a Western, a shoot-'em-up Western, we are not disturbed by the anachronisms so much. I mean, when John Wayne did not talk like a real cowboy, I'm pretty sure, So because it's a world that we are so familiar with in our time, in terms of thinking of it as an allegory for events in our own time, we make that leap pretty effortlessly. But we're not really used to doing that with the Iliad. I certainly didn't get it in grammar school. I think it's just our unfamiliarity with Homer and with Chaucer that we find it a little difficult to make that leap, and that the whole thing is a massive anachronism, because we're dealing with so many layers of anachronism, right? Homer, if he existed at all, right? We don't know exactly when he lived. We don't think that if he did live, and let's give him the benefit of the doubt that he was a person or several people, that he was living at the same time as these events. We have no idea. And then, all that we have of him is from other people copying what he said, and then what was written down of what he had said, and so on and so on and so on. And so there's so many layers there that by the time we get through Chaucer, it's a veritable onion of anachronisms. And so, I think it's understandable that as a historian, in particular, you would be tuned to all that and go, my gosh, this is just a salad of anachronisms. This is just a mess. But I think for Shakespeare and his audiences, those who were lucky enough to get to see this, they had so many references, there's so many callbacks and sort of in-jokes kind of things that was all part of it. The anachronisms were part of the draw, in a sense, for them. Yeah.
And the tale does resonate with the English, because there's this idea that they were the descendants of the Trojans.
Of Aeneas, yes, who, after he broke Dito's heart and she plunged off of a cliff, went to theoretically go to Rome, and several generations later there's Romulus and Remus. But Geoffrey of Monmouth thought it would be a good idea if Aeneas had a grandson or a son named Brutus, who came over and founded Britain first, because then, of course, the English have primacy over the Italians, which was an ongoing concern for the English at the time, that they were closer to the great heroes of Troy than even Romulus and Remus. So, the English automatically have a bias towards Troy. And so we see that in Shakespeare's treatment of the play. The Greeks are not treated well. The Trojans are scarcely treated better. Really, nobody comes out looking particularly good in this play, except maybe Diomedes.
He's another strange character in this odd play.
I am in love with Diomedes. He's an incredible character. And, if you have a chance to dip into the Iliad, I think it's book 6, there's the story of Diomedes. And Diomedes, as far as I know, is the only character, certainly in Greco-Roman myths, to wound a god and survive. He's the only mortal. Now, Hercules doesn't, but Hercules is a demigod and, so on. So,
That's
yeah,
different,
I think that's different. But Diomedes actually wounds both Ares and Aphrodite and walks away from it. He's, in the Iliad, an incredibly honorable character and smart and measured and, all these other things. And so when he appears in Troilus and Cressida, he shows up to escort Cressida over to the Greek side. And he behaves very honorably towards her. And so when she ends up in the Greek camp and essentially is immediately passed around by all the generals, and the implications are very clear here that she's there as a sexual plaything. Her father just leaves at that point, I guess, having delivered his daughter to his buddies. She has to pick someone, and Diomedes is an excellent choice. None of the other generals, none of the other soldiers are going to trespass on his personal property, which Cressida is at that point. He's already treated her more respectfully than anybody else in the play.
Yes, that's true.
And she knows he can protect her even from a god. And so I think she makes an excellent choice at that point. Troilus does not put up much of a fight.
No, he doesn't, does he? Yeah.
For Cressida. No. And in a play that's all about what a man will do for access to a woman, I think that's a fair point. Here, we've got Menelaus, who, is willing to go to war to retrieve his bride. We've got Paris, who was willing to steal her in the first place and, risk war. And then we've got Achilles, who, when his concubine Briseis is taken from him, he refuses to fight. He goes into a major sulk, even though he has Patroclus right there. But he liked Briseis too, apparently, and he's upset about the loss of not only access to her, but the loss of honor, the lack of respect that comes with that, and I'd like to touch on that in a moment. And I apologize right now to all the classic scholars if I am pronouncing anything wrong. I learned to pronounce these things by reading them in a book, so I apologize if it grates against anybody's ears. But in any event, so, we have Achilles, we have Paris, and Menelaus doing these huge, heroic gestures over love for a woman. And what does Troilus do? Daddy, I don't want you to take her away. I like her. Well, no, son, this is the way it's got to be. Okay.
That is about it.
That's it. That's it. And then he blames her. So, whatever for Troilus. But and I understand that at the time and after that, Cressida became a byword for infidelity.
Right. Yeah.
Right? As faithless as Cressida. But obviously, what was she supposed to do? what was she supposed to do in that situation? And, I think it's fair to say that Shakespeare, like, many men of his generation and men before and since, uh, could not necessarily put himself in a woman's place in that situation. Perhaps, and again, we don't know, did or did not understand how few options Cressida had. Now, Chaucer is kinder to Cressida than many of the other writers, and kind of indicates more that, she just felt like her life was out of her control, that she didn't have any choices. And so it's possible that Shakespeare had that idea in mind. We obviously can't say.
Another interesting character in there is Pandarus.
Mm-hmm.
And his obviously his name becomes as famous as any other from this play.
Isn't that fascinating? And the original Pandarus in the Iliad is nothing like that. Absolutely nothing like that. He's another kind of standard hero who, and I'm sorry, it's unmemorable. Let's put it that way. So unmemorable that I don't even remember what happened. But basically he gets in a fight and dies. And how he got turned into the Pandarus that we know and I won't say love, is one of those kind of telephone games that writers play over the centuries where, he gets changed a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. But, that his name has come to mean pander, and in a dual meaning in terms of to act as a procurer or a pimp, and also to just tell people whatever they want to hear, I think is an interesting juxtaposition that in our Anglo psyche, that we combine those two meanings, that somebody who procures people for someone else is basically telling them what they want to hear, giving them what they want to be given, and so on. And that is all inexplicably tied up with women's sexual agency is probably something we ought to spend a little time examining as a culture.
Yes, quite. And then Shakespeare gives him a nasty end as well. You get the feeling Shakespeare didn't like him as a character particularly.
Well, who could?
Sees him off with the pox.
Yeah, well, it's one of the few times that Shakespeare mentions, plagues or poxes. He doesn't bring it up very often.
Yes.
Just as we don't today bring up very often the effects of global illness currently taking its toll on our culture and so on. But, again, we have to connect that the pox was seen and was, part of sexually transmitted disease. And so, anybody who is providing sexual partners to people has to, certainly at that time and even now, has to face that possibility and take precautions. And
returning to the thing you mentioned at the top of our conversation, that this is a satire of a play, although the Hemmings and Condell seem to have a problem placing it in the folio, as I mentioned last time. The key satire seems to me, from a historical point of view, seems to be to do with Essex. And we have seen the Earl of Essex satire not only in Jonson's plays, but probably a little in Shakespeare as well during this period. These playwrights were on dangerous ground here, and it's pretty brave of them to do anything on the Essex subject, I would imagine, in front of the Queen particularly.
Well, in this case, he makes Essex look really bad, and so he probably felt like he was on reasonably safe ground. And the odds of her seeing the play are also sadly slim to none. As far as we know, she only saw 2 of his plays. So, I think in our minds, we love the idea of the Lord Chamberlain's men regularly performing in front of Elizabeth. I don't think we have any proof of that at all. She may, barely have known that Shakespeare existed, other than the fact that he was part of the theater scene, which was not very large. Um, but with Achilles, he's itching for a fight. Doesn't really have one yet with Troy. They haven't from when they get to Troy and when they actually start fighting Troy. And so all these soldiers sitting around, and he's got the Myrmidons with him, right? The Ant-Man soldiers, who wore these shiny black, kind of carapace-shaped armor, so that they looked like giant, terrifying Ant-Men.
Yes.
And so they went around terrorizing all the local villages. And that was how he obtained the priestess Briseis that he wanted to keep for himself. Now, Agamemnon had gotten Chrysis, who was a priestess from the same town or whatever, and he had to give up Chrysis and because her father wanted her back. And her father was a priest of Apollo, and there was a plague going through the Greek camps. And so in order to appease Apollo, Chrysis was returned. And then Agamemnon in a snit said, well, I'm going to go get Achilles' lady then, and took Briseis away. Now, this was an insult in more ways than one, because the Greeks and likely the Trojans too were very concerned with something called timeo, Timao, which roughly translates to honor. But Chrysis was part of Achilles' timeo, and your timeo, basically your level, your status, determined several things. It determined how many spoils you got after the battle, how many men listened to you, how much food you got, all these really important rankings that could affect your ability to survive and your ability to protect your troops were affected by this timeo. And Achilles was the greatest warrior in the world. Agamemnon was just the guy they put in charge. In a fair fight between Agamemnon and Achilles, we know who would have won. And so, Agamemnon appears to me to have sort of a chip on his shoulder about this. And so he goes and takes Chrysis away. And Achilles is understandably in that context annoyed. Now, then what he does is refuses to fight. So Achilles is basically saying, and it's a really profound meditation on honor and sacrifice, because he's saying, look, I came over here. This isn't even my fight. I didn't commit to saving Helen when she married Menelaus. That's all your guys' deal. But I came because you asked me to. And now you're telling me that the whole reason I'm fighting, this timeo that I'm supposed to be gaining that's so important, can be taken away at the whim of a commander. A commander who I could just beat in a fair fight. And so what am I fighting for? And so this is the underlying question in the Iliad. What are we fighting for? Why are we fighting? Well, fast forward to Shakespeare and Essex and all of that. And what had happened is that Elizabeth had sent Essex to Ireland. He had futzed around, terrorizing the countryside, terrible bloodshed. And then when she said stop it, he refused to fight. And so there's this direct correlation with Essex's behavior. And Shakespeare does not make Achilles some sort of hero contemplating man's inhumanity to man for short-term honor. Instead, he's basically sulking over a woman while he's clearly in love with Patroclus, and in a snit over this and that. And so I think as a satire subject, Essex was a pretty safe bet at that time. A lot safer than making fun of the members of Elizabeth I's court and her favorites who are currently in favor, as Ben Jonson did.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
And just to go back to a point you mentioned earlier as well, that you'd seen a production that really changed your mind about the play. So can you tell us something about what it was about that production that so transformed you?
Oh my goodness. That RSC production and name dropping our friend Darren, he saw it in person, for which I am incredibly jealous. But I honestly don't know. Even as a director, I sometimes watch productions and feel like it was magic. Like there's just some sort of magic to that production, a genius in the way it was staged in this sort of Mad Max setting. They move Helen into this slightly more active role. She becomes the chorus, which is an interesting and I felt useful and impactful choice for that character. The acting was superb. All I can do is credit the director. Honestly, a marquee subscription for 1 month is not that much and considerably cheaper than a ticket to a decent production. And I really recommend it highly to anyone who wants to understand this play. There's a lot of mixed gender casting, which I appreciated. Some of the generals are female, female presenting actors. It doesn't change the plot at all, because nothing these characters do has anything to do with their genitalia necessarily, or their gender presentation is kind of irrelevant, but just fantastic acting all around. But the actor who played Thersites, who is one of my favorite characters.
Well, should we talk a bit about Thersites? Because
Yes,
he's another
Thersites.
one who really stands out, I think, as a Shakespeare creation of some significance.
Well, he is in the Iliad. And what he does in the Iliad, after Achilles kind of gripes before the assembled Greeks about what Agamemnon has done, saying, this isn't happen. And after he gripes for a while about this, Thersites basically gets up and says, Agamemnon, you're a piece of crap. What are you doing? You're arrogant. You're leading us all down the path. You're the reason that we got this plague in the first place. You created this terrible situation by trespassing against Apollo and his priestess, and now you're punishing Achilles for it. And, unfortunately, Achilles then beats up Thersites. And so, how dare you criticize your betters, basically, and then goes back to his sulking. But, the fact that only Thersites will speak up for Achilles may have been something of an insult at the time for Achilles. And so I think that's the logic that we're working with here.
Right, yeah.
But Thersites, even in the Iliad, is described as having a pointy head and scraggly hair and, an ungainly appearance, to put it gently. And so it's understandable that, Shakespeare, desperate for a fool in this situation, plucks Thersites out of the Iliad and gives him some fantastic lines.
My thanks to Rachel for taking the time to talk to us. I hope that her thoughts on the play and her knowledge of the background relating to the Iliad were helpful for your understanding of the play, as it certainly was for mine. But before I let Rachel go, I was interested to know what was next in her very busy schedule.
Well, I've been working for the last 18 months on, it started with a book called The Influences Behind Shakespeare's Plays. And the goal of that book was to look at all of the influences. We tend to look at just the sources, Holinshed, Plutarch, Christopher Marlowe, both his influences that had been from the past and the ones that were part of his cohort and his regular life, and also what was happening in the time in terms of what were some of the politics going on, some of the events that could have influenced the plays that he wrote at the time. And so as I was writing that book, I thought, well, I really should talk about these historical characters, particularly when you get into the English history plays. Who was Henry V? Who was Eleanor of Aquitaine? Who were all these people? And they clearly influenced him in some way. And so I started writing the English history portion of that. And before I knew it, I had 30,000 words. And I realized that I had accidentally started a second book, and thankfully my publisher agreed. And so that turned into its own book, which is Who's Who in Shakespeare's History Plays. And, for that I start with Homer and end up with Henry VIII. And I I learned so much, obviously, from doing this. But through this process, I basically teach each character who has a history outside of Shakespeare's plays and that was in a history play, and provide a little biography about them. And as you're going through these, I kept thinking, well, I can leave that person out. No, you can't leave any of them out. Some of them I left out because uh, we just have nothing on them. All we know is that they died at that particular date after participating in a rebellion or something like that. There just isn't enough to say anything interesting about them. Um, Others are just a little vague. Who was the mayor of London? Well, we're not sure which one of these guys Shakespeare might have been talking about or Holinshed might have been talking about. But, quite often, many of these characters have a really fascinating backstory. One of my favorites is Dr. William Butts. He's in Henry VIII, and he turns out to be a really interesting person from that court. There's quite a few characters. There's a massive Neville's. There's the fact that one Buckingham after another gets executed for treason, I think is both interesting and tragic. It gives you a lot of context. And in the past, I had trouble getting into those English history plays. Now, Shakespeare, via Holinshed and Plutarch and so on, uh, deviates from the history as we know it today. But I think it really needs to be pointed out that none of this was Shakespeare's invention. He did not make Richard III look any worse than Richard III already looked to Shakespeare's contemporaries. Shakespeare conflates timelines. Sometimes he combines people. How many Somersets do you need? I guess only one, according to Shakespeare. And so, all of that took a tremendous amount of research and focus and everything else. And I don't think I would have started this project on purpose. But I'm so glad that I did. It's my favorite accidental project ever. And honestly, at this point, one of the ones that I am most proud of. My editor and I worked really hard to bring as much truth to these people's lives as we possibly could. We're speaking for people who are long dead, who can't speak for themselves. And so, I think most historians feel a certain obligation to represent their subjects as accurately as possible. And that's what I endeavored to do.
So look out for Racheal's new books, Who's Who in Shakespeare's Plays, and the influences behind Shakespeare's history plays, and I'll certainly be giving them a mention here when the publication dates are confirmed. And don't forget to check out Shakespeare and Friends on YouTube for further insights from Racheal and Darren Feebury-Jones. I've put links to this and Racheal's other books in the show notes, as well as a link to the Royal Shakespeare Company production of Troilus and Cressida that Racheal mentioned. Next time we will be returning to the works of Ben Jonson. After the Poetasta and his early comedies, he switched lanes, so that we have history and tragedy in his next plays. In the meantime, if you haven't done so already, please join the Facebook page or group, or find the podcast on Instagram or Blue Sky just to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head on over to Patreon, where you will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation for selected episodes. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or through the website, where you can leave me a voice message by clicking on the microphone icon, or you can write to me on the contact page. That's all at www.thehistoryofeuropean theatre.com.